And so I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Becca Muenich from Arizona State University. She's also an affiliate of the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. She's an assistant professor of environmental engineering at Arizona State University. And her expertise is in modeling of phosphorus transport and nutrients and figuring out ways to address these issues. So I'm happy to turn it over to Becca to tell us about her new efforts to find out where this phosphorus is in the manure. So take it over, Becca.
Great, thanks, Jim. And can you confirm that my audio is working okay? I switched to, okay, great. So let me make sure I share my screen here. And you can confirm that you're seeing my screen now. All right. So yeah, great segue. I'm going to talk a little bit about basically the need to have a national animal feeding operations inventory. As Jim mentioned, there's a lot of phosphorus in animal manure. So the better idea we have of where that manure is, the more opportunity we have for recovery. And I'll try to go fast, maybe make up some time here. So I just always like to start with an aerial image of, one example of an animal feeding operation where you can, if you have seen one before, you can recognize from a picture that this is one. So just to kind of point out that it's pretty easy to find them if you're looking for them. They're large. If you live near one, you definitely know it. So having this inventory is really kind of a practical thing, but I think most of you on this call probably know this, but the sort of increased demand for meat, dairy, and other kinds of animal products has increased over time, not just in the US, but worldwide. There's a trend towards larger operations. This tends to be more efficient in many ways than kind of smaller distributed operations. And not only are these operations concentrated with the number of animals contained on the farm, but they're also concentrated in space, and that tends to be for more economical processing of whatever product they're working on. And then so these large farms or clusters of large farms can produce the same amount of waste per year as some cities. And so, I like to talk about, where are these animal cities that we can identify, because those are really great opportunities if, we've proven we can collect waste at a city scale and treat it or recover important things from it. If we can find these animal cities, that's going to make it easier for recovery. We know it can also be helpful to know where they are for impacts, and I've just kind of listed a few kind of known impacts here, but I think what I really want to hammer home is that, again, this is where we can really target recovery of organic matter, nutrients. And, out west here, water, it's a really great source of something that we don't have a lot of. So, the better idea we have of where these recovery points are, the faster we can move towards, systems that can actually recover these resources. So, since coming to ASU and starting to work with the Alliance, working on a national inventory for the US that hopefully methods can be applied globally as well of all regulated and non-regulated animal feeding operations has been a goal of mine. And it's certainly a goal of a lot of other folks around the US. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I also just want to give a background for those who may not be as familiar. But animal feeding operations versus concentrated animal feeding operations, I just want to quickly mention any animals that are confined for 45 days or more in a 12-month period, and where crops, vegetation are not sustained during a normal growing season over any portion of the facility or lot are considered animal feeding operations in the US. And if they meet those conditions and certain size numbers or actively discharged to waters of the US, then they can be considered a concentrated animal feeding operation. And this is at the federal level. So these are some examples of what kinds of numbers make something a large CAFO, which is in the federal regulations supposed to be regulated as and given an NPDES permit. And then medium CAFOs and small CAFOs can be, depending on the conditions, also regulated under an NPDES permit. I say this and want to point this out. This is, I think, a 2018 map of for each state, how many CAFOs per that large CAFO designation there are in each state. and then point out that this is a really complex regulatory environment. And the reason I pointed out is because it matters for why we don't have an inventory currently. But CAFOs, if they're designated as a large CAFO or, you know, depending on the conditions, a medium or small, they're required at the federal level to get an NPDES permit, just like a wastewater treatment plant, and they're regulated under the Clean Water Act. However, because of recent rule changes and different interpretations of those regulations at the state level, depending on the state you're in, not every CAFO, even every large CAFO, is required to get an NPDES permit. So for example, on this map, Ohio has 262 CAFOs per that federal definition, but only 30 of those have NPDES permits. And the reason that matters is because that controls what data is publicly available, and it basically shows, you know, why or why not we might be able to find from just state records where these operations are. So because of that regulatory complexity, we don't have this national inventory that would help with recovery, but that does vary by state, which also further complicates things. And just to a little bit of a plug here with the Alliance, a year or two ago, we started compiling all relevant regulations for both biosolids and manure land applications into this database that, if you want to go to the Alliance website, we call this tool GISP because we also added a bunch of other relevant data to this. But I just pulled up, this is Alabama, and you can read through and link to what are the regulations for each state specific to the land application of these biosolids and manures. And we have a related publication that's in review right now. So other things I just want to point out with respect to regulations that, you know, even if we did have a list of all regulated large CAFOs at the federal level, you know, we might miss some because if a farmer operates just under those animal size numbers, then they wouldn't be regulated. And we've heard that from farmers as well. And then sometimes it's not necessarily about the number of animals, but about how much land is available per number of animals. So we need to know some more about that in terms of, you know, is there going to be excess in this, you know, area of concentrated animals? And then, you know, what about the number of animals per farm per sensitive environmental conditions? So you might have a lot of land, but if it's already high in phosphorus, then maybe that's still an opportunity to recover rather than land apply. And then also just knowing, you know, how many other farms are within a certain vicinity is just going to be really helpful for thinking about, is a system that's going to cost a lot, take a lot of capital costs, going to be effective in a region. So we really need a map of all farms, not just regulated farms, not just those that meet the large CAFO size limits, but all these feeding operations that have, that contribute to a lot of animals and being in one area. So it's kind of cities of animals. So now I want to just talk about the current approaches to identifying where these operations are in space. And I'm going to start from basic to advanced. So there are manual approaches. This is an approach that the Environmental Working Group, they did a report in the Maumee watershed where they basically look at an image like that first one I showed you, and they identify through some steps that they've outlined, is this an animal feeding operation? What kind is it? And they also estimate based on the size, again, by hand, you know, how many animals might be there. And just as an example, you know, I mentioned that Ohio has about 30 regulated NPDES permitted facilities, which are shown on this map. And the Maumee, this from the EWG report, by hand identifying these animal operations, these are the operations they found in that same area of this red square. So you can see by just going with what state databases supply, we miss a lot of these operations. There's a similar, I'll just mention that this is a really you know, labor-intensive approach to be able to go image by image, you know, and look for these operations. A similar approach that has just come out recently by this group called Project Counterglow has attempted using citizen science to make a nationwide map And this is where they ask people who, everyday folks who may not know, is something a CAFO or not, or an animal feeding operation or not, to look at different places in space and identify them. You can imagine this might get you a lot of data as you see here, but it's not very verifiable, and it's also missing a lot of information. So that is another kind of manual approach that we've seen. And then there are some automatic approaches and that I've been working on with my group, and there's some other groups that are also getting into this space. We originally started back when I was at the University of Michigan looking at remote sensing data, and what we started with was looking at combining height data from LiDAR information, which basically just tells you the height in a landscape, with whether something was vegetation or not. So basically removing trees. And through this approach, looking at height and vegetation, combining them, we're able to identify barns, and this is in Ohio. And you can see we combined it with an object-oriented classification scheme, which allowed us to actually create shapes of the barns. So instead of just having points where these operations are located, we were able to identify and have the barn shape, which again can help with identifying animal type as well as number of animals. One of the issues with this approach is it's very data intensive. LiDAR is not everywhere because it's a big data step to be able to get that. So that's kind of what we started with, but we've been looking at other approaches. In the meantime, there was a group, and sorry, this is so blurry, out of Stanford, Dr. Daniel Ho, who they were using some deep learning methods to identify CAFOs in North Carolina. And you can see what they're trying to do over here is identified using a picture, just like I showed you, is something they were looking at swine and dairy, a swine or a dairy CAFO, and specifically in North Carolina with some good success. But again, this required lots of hours of developing training data by humans looking at pictures and saying yes or no, this is a CAFO. And one of the issues with this approach is that it's developed for North Carolina and how CAFOs might look image-wise in North Carolina, but it may not necessarily translate outside of North Carolina or to other kinds of CAFO types. So definitely a step in the right direction, but it still needs work. Now, what my students and I are currently working on is transitioning, rather than trying to look at an image and say visually whether or not that might be an APHO or a CAFO, we're looking at environmental parameters. Essentially, we've been able to identify that these CAFOs and APHOs have certain environmental signatures that really make them pop on a map, and that's what this is showing here. I didn't list any of them because we're still unpublished and working on this. And the advantage of using these environmental parameters as opposed to the visualization approach is that one, we can get data on environmental parameters worldwide, at least the ones that we're looking at. And two, we believe and hypothesize that these environmental parameters that we're looking at don't really vary across regions. And so how a CAFO, say a dairy CAFO in North Carolina might pop up in our environmental parameters is going to look very similar even to ones we might see out here in Arizona. So we're still working on this. It's a work in progress, but we've got some pretty good results right now that we're hoping to publish soon, so we can tell you more about that. So that's kind of the methods from manual to really automatic approaches that we're working on and others are working on. But we want to keep the work going. So what we've also been doing is developing this database of known APHOs and CAFOs based on state databases. And this isn't all we've got so far, but this gives you an idea. There are some states that publish all regulated APHOs or CAFOs in their state, and we have retrieved that and downloaded that. And one thing we can do with this is move on with some other analyses we might want, or use this data to train and validate the models that we're developing, either in the automatic realm. We also have formed this unfunded working group. I'd just like to say that this has been a working group that's all really interested in developing the national database. So we've been working with the Stanford group that has the deep learning approach, and Daniel Ho's lab at Stanford. the Environmental Law and Policy Center out of Chicago, who worked with the EWG on the MAMI work, and they're also now working in some other Midwestern states to do that manual identification. We're open to anyone else who has methods or is really interested in developing this. Please just contact me. But what we're really doing in this sort of unfunded working group is just comparing our methods, sharing our resources, and trying to combine some of our approaches to get to a national database. So I just leave these concluding thoughts up here that animal agriculture accounts for a very large proportion of recoverable phosphorus. And so to be able to really accurately account for them in something like I do, maybe environmental models or for recovery options, we really need to know where they are. And we have some methods available in a motivated working group. We're still looking for funding, so that's a shameless plug there. But if anyone is really interested in this, I'm happy to talk more. And I think that is, yep, my last slide. So I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Fantastic, Becca. That's super exciting. Really cutting edge stuff there. So I think we'll take a couple minutes to receive a couple questions from the group before we move on to our panel discussion. So if you have a question, please raise your hand in the chat box there.
Great, Jim. Yeah, I got Dave Ficari. I've just asked you to unmute if you want to ask your question. That'd be great. Oh, and I should note that I've opened up the chat too if people want to chat. Dave, can you unmute?
I just unmuted you, Dave. Go ahead.
There you go. It didn't allow me to do it myself. All right, thank you. All right, thanks, Becca. That's really interesting, really important that we could get a handle on this. Have you considered using SIC codes, the Standard Industrial Classification codes? Would states have records for tax purposes and other purposes? They classify all their businesses with these SIC codes that include beef cattle, feedlots, et cetera. And I'm wondering if those might be able to catch some of these under the radar feedlots.
We have it, but I will certainly look into that, Dave. So thanks for the tip.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Next one, Tom Brulsema. Good to see your name, Tom.
Oh, well, thanks, Matt. And thank you, Rebecca, for that presentation. It's addressing some very interesting questions, certainly. My question is, once you've identified these CAFOs, it's probably not hard to identify their maximum capacity, but I wonder what assumptions you use regarding the current operating capacity or the actual number of animals produced per year, and thus, of course, correlated to the manure produced. What assumptions do you use, and have you done any ground truthing or comparison to the total numbers from the NAS inventory of livestock?
Yeah, that's a great question, and sort of two questions there. One, in terms of estimating size and then thus production, that's something we've thought about. We haven't done. I know that the EWG and ELPC in their manual classifications, they do that based on the barn size, and they also have some methods for trying to estimate, is this an empty barn or not, based on various factors, just because it could be a big barn that maybe isn't either is going to fill soon or has recently shut down. So we also have some remote sensing techniques to look at things like how hot it is in the barn. So we could look at that as a signature of whether or not there are animals inside. So mostly it's looking at size estimates, comparing to standards maybe within the state for, how many animals could be in that size of barn. But you're right, that's definitely a next step in, research terms of trying to figure out and validate that. Now, comparing to NAS is also an interesting thing. We try to do we've tried to do also with just number of operations. Because in NAS, for some of the animal categories, they have a large category, like for cattle, it's 500 or above. So while not all farms with 500 more or above are CAFOs, all CAFOs are going to be in that category. So we've tried to do some comparisons to see if the number that we come up with is somewhat similar or within that range to the NAS census data. But it all depends on when the imagery was taken. How good the census was that year, those are definitely some things that we're looking into, I guess. But you know, that's definitely a next step once we've got the location figured out, for sure. Thanks, Tom.
Jim, I think we should leave it there in the interest of time.
Great. All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Becca, for that great presentation, and looking forward to hear more about this topic as we proceed.